Okay. So thank you for joining us today for this very special workshop, Caregiving Stories of Love, Life, and Wisdom. This workshop is a part of our November Caregiving in its Many Forms series, and the timing is perfect as we begin the holiday season, spending time with family and friends. What better way to capture memories and family history than through our stories? Our presenter today is Sylvia Lovely, and this workshop is sponsored by the University of Kentucky Work Life. Sylvia, would you like to introduce yourself and get started?
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Sylvia Lovely, and I'm going to be very minimal in my introduction of me. You can find out about me. I've got contact information in the guide and the resource information that you'll be getting from Hazel. But I do want to tell you that I have taught for a number of years for Carnegie Center for Literacy and Learning, and my signature class is Writing and Sharing the Stories of Your Life. I get a lot of caregivers. I've also done some work for NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and other entities as well. I'm a restaurant owner here in town, Azure Restaurant and Patio, and I'm a podcaster for Family Tree Food and Stories, which I'll tell you about a little bit later because it very much impacts on your work as caregivers. But a very timely seminar, Hazel. Thank you very much. Let me just say, maybe this is like repeating something you already know, but it's a staggering set of statistics, and I'd say it's mild and compared to what really goes on out there. But according to the AARP, 1 in 4 adults, American Association of Retired Persons, I guess is what that is. 1 in 4 adults is a caregiver. 29% are in the sandwich generation where they're caring for children and parents, or maybe other kinds of where they're sandwiched in between generations. 40% will say that it's high intensity work. They provide medication, maybe injections, and all of those kinds of things. 1 in 5 report that they're in poor health. 1 in 4 taking on debt. Half of them have financial burdens that are related to this, and we know that the workplace has not caught up with this tsunami. So that's what we face. Me personally, I'm a caregiver. I think we'll all be at some point in our lives, probably rare instances where we're not. But I started out with my children, of course. And then I became part of the sandwich. I was caring for children at the same time I was caring for parents, in this case, my mother, who passed in 2001 of cancer. Then my dad, in his mid 80s, I started having to intensely care for my dad. That's him up there in that picture. I'm going to talk about him in a minute. And their dying wish for me was take care of your brother. My brother is challenged. So every single morning, I feel like a celebrated psychoanalyst. I have to bring him down from the ledge from some paranoia kinds of issues that he has. But I care for my brother. He's doing very well. Probably not all attributed to me, but he is doing well, and I feel like I've honored my parents. But let me tell you a little bit about Walter, standing there in front of Good Foods Co-op in about his early 90s. And I want to illustrate his story because his story is one that I hope all of you, if you're not story collectors and writers and sharers, I hope that this will give you an aha moment. But let me tell you a story really quick. He's standing there, but one day I had him at a doctor's appointment. My dad was born poor in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, and he had no education. He left Kentucky to go work in the factory up in Dayton, Ohio. And I was taking him to the grocery store because we were driving on Harrisburg Road, and he said, "I need some things from Kroger's, Sybia," which is what he called me. And I said, "Well, that's great. There's a Kroger's right here," and it was the one in Beaumont. Emphatically, he said, "No, I don't want to go to the rich people's Kroger's." And I said, "The rich people's Kroger's? What is that?" "I don't want to go there. I want to go to the poor people's Kroger's." I said, "What is that?" And I hope I don't offend anyone here because I went with him to what he called the poor people's Kroger's. And guys, there is a real culture of Kroger's. And in the what he called his Kroger's, people talked to one another. The clerks knew the people, and the aisles were a little narrower, and it was just a different kind of atmosphere. What did I learn from that story? I learned about his intense pride at being poor, born poor in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, that it was a cultural thing. So I guess my point is your tiny little stories mean so much. So next slide, Hazel. I want to share with you first our objectives here today. One, I hope that you'll have an aha moment. If you're not a story writer, teller, sharer, and any way that you can be, I hope you have that aha moment of inspiration that, yes, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to be a story warrior. That's what I call people who kind of fall into this and fall prey to its powers. But first of all, let me say that we want to get you to the point where you recognize and enjoy the value of the gift that comes from caregiving and how you can use story writing and telling skills to become aware of those unexpected moments that may go unnoticed amidst the challenges. And understanding the power, the sheer power of learning from one another, from your caregivee, the caregiver learns a life story, to appreciate and honor that gift despite the challenges. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Hazel, I'm going to call on you. Can you unmute yourself? You're going to help me in this little exercise we're going to do. Hi, Hazel. How are
Hi,
you?
Sylvia. I'm ready. I'm good. I'm ready.
Okay. Now, I do this name game whenever I'm in front of an audience. And if I was able to see all of you and bring all of you together, here's what we would do. We would each form dyads, two people, and we would share a story about how we got our name. And the room fills with laughter whenever I've been able to do that. And I'll miss this. So, Hazel, laugh when we do this. Okay. So,
Okay.
humor me. All right.
Okay.
Emote. All right. Hazel, I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to ask me a question. How did you get your name?
Well, that is a very easy one to answer. I was named after my Aunt Hazel,
Uh huh.
who my mother and I'm sure my father, who it was her brother, but my mother loved her. She died just a year after I was born, so I
Uh
never
huh.
got to meet her. But some great stories about her. She was kind of a proper lady. She had white hair at the age of 25, which I always thought that would be my fate. Funny how you kind of hang those things on the
Mm-hmm.
name. And then, when I was 16, it wasn't such, so much fun to be named Hazel when everybody else was Jennifer or Susie.
That's
Um,
true.
yeah. And then it's Hazel the Witch, Hazel the Maid, Hazel the Nut. So there's some of those that go along with it. But I've come to appreciate my name because it is different enough to kind of stand out. And ironically, there are a lot more Hazels that I come across in Kentucky than when I lived in Chicago for my whole life. So that's my story, Sylvia. How
That
did you
is,
get your
that's
name?
such a great story. Oh, mine's very simple. And by the way, Hazel is making a comeback, like Edith and some other names like that. Really, really making a comeback. But anyway, how did I get my name? Well, the moment I was born, it was really clear that I wasn't Mark. My parents were convinced I was Mark. So my mother was overnight in the hospital, and the next morning, she heard a Spanish singer on her radio station, and the name was Sylvia. Now, that wasn't a name that rolled off the tongue in Eastern Kentucky in a charity hospital, but that was me, Sylvia. Later became Sibia. My father could never, he couldn't deal with Sylvia. It was too formal. So I became Sibia, and anything he talked to me about was Sibia. So that's our story. Okay. Now, let's talk about it. What did it show us? Storytelling is nothing but telling a story to one another. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an ending. It's like talking to your neighbor over the fence. You're all storytellers, aren't you? Every one of us. That's how humans communicate from the earliest times and forward. We form community. I know a bit more about Hazel and her namesake than I ever did before. If you're in a room full of people, everybody, even people who tell me, I don't know how I got my name, they'll tell you how they got the dog's name. I mean, it's that kind of spontaneity, and we learn about each other. Uh, Forming community. Third, you change the world. Now, Anne Frank never thought her diary would be found by her father. And he had a choice. He could release it or he could keep it private. And he chose to release it. And billions of people now read that diary and how much it meant and has the most intimate details of her life contained therein. And you may not write a story or share a name story that will change the world in that kind of span, but it will change the world a little bit for the better because that's what every conversation does, isn't it? Every conversation can change our viewpoint. And so we go to the next slide. how story changes our lives. Did a little bit of work on this because I just finished a project with the UK Extension Service, a three-part story sessions on how to write stories. And so you might check with your extension agent. Hazel, I think that probably is in our resource guide. But we came up with a lot of help and scientific basis for the fact that story truly changes us for the better. It stimulates your brain. It supports mental health, self-growth, reflection, awareness, effective decision making. Thinking about, oh, well, maybe I should have done that differently. And you have a conversation with someone, and that's how we maybe change a bad decision that we made. Serves as a gift to yourself and to those who care about you. Provides an opportunity to pass along wisdom and life lessons. It strengthens our relationships and enhances engagement with others and the environment around us. If I had you all in a room, or if I could have enough time, which we can't, I would have you look around the room and find one thing that stood out to you and make a story about it. And some people have reacted, like, I don't know what that meant, but we'll get into that here in a moment. But you capture family tree and health history and documents values and beliefs. But I love the fact that science has actually shown that our brain changes if we, like if you're writing about loss and grief, for instance, and there's many pieces of loss in caregiving, but it actually changes the brain chemistry. And there's a lot of science. I don't have time to get into it, and I'm not a science expert on this. I will say one thing, and I shared this, and we share this very extensively in the Extension Project. This is not a substitute for counseling. I'm not a counselor. I'm not, so may at times, like we all do, armchair Freud and all of that kind of stuff, but not officially a counselor. And I've had people come to my class, break down in tears, and I know something is wrong. And I go up to them afterwards and I say, you are welcome to be in this class, but if you need help, we can help you find a counselor. And I think that's real important because sometimes it goes beyond that. So the next slide is this is a tale of two stories, yours and theirs. Now, most of the time, the stories of caregiving are intertwined, right? You are, you're telling the story. It can slant toward, I'm telling my story as a caregiver, or it can slant toward just like the service called Storyworth. Storyworth is a service where you purchase a package, and as the loved one, you can send a question a week, a question a month, whatever you choose, to the loved one, and they'll answer that question. And then you have a compilation at the end of the year of that person's life story. So that's really a tale of them telling the tale. But it can also come from memories. And that's when I think it's intertwined. And of course, I think that's kind of my personal preference is how they become intertwined. If your dad served in World War II, as mine did, I wasn't around then. But he can tell me about it. And it's the memories, or it's memories that I have of hearing him tell stories, or memories I have with him even today. One of my favorite ones is him giving my son advice. My son, his grandson, had a disappointment at college, hadn't gotten an internship or something he wanted. And my dad looked up at me, remember, born poor in Eastern Kentucky, pulling himself up by his bootstraps, lied to get into the Army, blah, blah, blah. And he said, David, things never work out, which just I thought was hilarious because my dad was an optimist and I couldn't figure out what was the resolution of that? What was that story all about? And I think because he was able to reach heights that he never thought he could before, and he wasn't looking for internships or anything like that, things don't work out. He made them work out. That's my brightest view of that statement, but I absolutely love it. So that's either your story or theirs, and that the beauty of it is that it provides that kind of underpinning to each of your stories. Ray Bradbury had it right. Your intuition knows what to write, so get out of the way and let it happen, which is kind of the reason why the next slide is so important. The next slide is about the steps that I have kind of developed over time that I provide with the folks that I'm working with. It's about collecting your stories. It's about crafting your stories. and it's about curating your stories, which is about choosing just the right stories for the right purpose that you may have. So let's take up collecting first. Becoming Finding those unexpected moments, becoming the story warrior. That's what in the extension project, it's becoming story warriors. Is your story is your superpower, because it truly is. But it's about tiny moments. And I was thinking about that today. What is a tiny moment that I have just had? Because once you become a story warrior, it's almost dangerous because you see stories everywhere. And don't do this while you're driving, but you'll be listening to the radio and someone will say something. Well, this morning I had one of those kind of epiphany moments. I was reading an essay on technology and how it's just consumed our lives, over consumed our lives, and someone quoted King Lear, and a blind character in King Lear, the play by Shakespeare. And they say, "Well, how do you see?" And he says, I replies, "I see feelingly," which is something I think is really relevant to what we're talking about here today. Your stories about how they made you feel, and how important it is to expect those stories to come in very, very tiny moments with big messages. To continue my father's story, I remember so well another foundational block in his personality was going to his favorite coffee spot, which was a nondescript cafeteria at Myers on Ruthio Way. Couldn't get more plain and ordinary. And we get that cup of coffee, which wasn't very good. And we walk over there. There were a group of managers. I could tell they were. They were very well dressed and they had Myers on their shirts. And I started to sit down next to them. And my dad said, "No, I don't sit next to bosses." Again, another building block of the story of my father's life. Now, if you had that moment to walk around the room, I had an experience with a woman once who said, when I was someone working with me on the extension project, she said, "Sylvia, I just don't get it. My mother was wearing a yellow dress. And I don't, that popped in my head. She had a yellow dress on one day. And she said, I don't see what's the story in that." I had a victory. I did a victory lap because later on in the project, we were working on these 3 series. And she said, "I figured it out. It was her in a photograph with my dad on their 25th wedding anniversary in this beautiful yellow dress that she had shopped for days to find." What a wonderful, wonderful memory. It was because of all that we were talking about, she had started to look and find that story. And so it happens in the tiniest of moments. Listening to the radio, I've become a real addict. I in a bank line, in an elevator, anywhere I am, I find a story, and I'm keeping a journal. I try to write these most important stories. The way I got started as a story writer was one of my mayors. I worked for mayors all over the state, and I had young children, and I was traveling all the time. And my mentor, the mayor of Burkesville, Kentucky, said to me one day, he said, "Sylvia, you meet so many interesting people. Why don't you start writing their stories?" Because he's right. They were just characters. To run for public office, you have to be certified to be a character. And I said, "I don't have time," which is constantly said. I don't have time to write stories. That's not my thing. He said, "No, no, no." He said, "You just write down the bare outlines of a story, put it on index cards." This was old school. This was many years ago. My boys are now 41 and 43, so they were little then. And so I did that, and I have stacks and stacks of those cards. Now, there are other ways. Now, I prefer to do old school, so I'll write in my journal 2 or 3 things that happened, and maybe something I'm going to write about the next day. Every moment, whether it's happy, don't shy away from sad. Sad means something too. Do all of those kinds of stories, and watch out and don't fall prey to what could happen to you, and you become what I've become, which is a story warrior. Now, let me move on to crafting your story. Now, a lot of people will say, "Why? I don't really care. Beginning, middle, ending. I don't know." Have you ever been around people who don't know how to tell a story, don't know the punchline, or leave the punchline out, or leave some critical factor out? The only thing I'll say about crafting is you can learn as much as you want, you can learn as little as you want. if you don't want to do that, if you're not interested in writing a memoir or writing something people will read someday, maybe it's just your own purposes, be careful. Might find it in an attic one of these days, so you want to be a little bit careful. But all of us have a different style, and when you get the guide that Hazel's going to send out, it'll tell you there are no grades here. You have your own style of writing a story. All I'm going to share today is just maybe, you might want to try it. Take a class, go to the Carnegie Center or someone and take a class. Because if you can make it interesting, just imagine 2 or 3 generations from now, people sitting around a fire at Christmas time telling these stories because you wrote them really well and they have great punchlines. Some of them are funny, some of them are sad, and hopefully you have enough of the funny ones that you can get people real excited. I'm going to start by telling you on the story arc. If you're getting ready to write your stories, the arc. And what do you think of when you hear that? You think of that thing that floated on, the 40 days of rain of day and night or something like that, okay? Well, what the story arc is, and I'm just going to finger it for you. You don't have to, it's not like something, it looks like an elephant, okay? What you start out with the story arc is sort of things that have become normal. Whatever the normal is, and I'll illustrate that in a minute, it rises up in that hump. And at the top is an explosion. You want to think about it as the thing that happens. The rest of it is the resolution. And then there's a line that's slightly above the beginning line because there's a new normal, something that you learned. And I'll give you an example of that. My husband's mother, Essie, willed herself to die. And it was so sad for us. Her husband had died in January, and I think she was a church lady. They were church people. He was a pastor, and they were a team all their entire life. And Essie laid in her bed. She refused to eat. And so finally, the normal became sitting there and talking to her and kind of letting her pursue the path that she wanted to pursue. Well, one day, Bernie was sitting with her. I don't think at this time I was, and I have done plenty of the sitting with her. And he said, Mamaw, which is her preferred pronoun. That's what she became, was Mamaw with her grandchildren, sitting there with her son. And he said, if you're going to do this, do you maybe want to go ahead and designate who should get your things when you pass? He said she looked up at him with weak eyes, but with a strong voice, she said, no, I want to watch them fight over it. I mean, it was a great moment in a sad setting, right? But it was so her because she was such a spitfire all her life. And so she was going to sit in heaven and watch everybody fight over that mattress, that chest of drawers, or whatever it might have been. Another simpler way to think about story writing is it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an ending. And if you can, and you can think of a hook, begin with your hook. It's a little bit, it's whatever the new normal became, but, one illustration is a woman who was writing her story about her dad. And she began her story, and by the way, I prefer the small vignettes. They're manageable. You can write smaller stories, and then you can combine the stories in a smaller kind of format and several stories strung along. But she began her story with this. My father owned funeral homes in eastern Texas. And I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. But then she said, he came into my room one day on a Sunday and told me to put on my good clothes and my patent leather shoes. We were going to the funeral home. Now I'm hooked. What? And then she begins to tell the story of getting on her best clothing and her brother and all of that. The ending resolution of that story, they were going to become the families of paupers who had no family. And her father started that in his funeral homes, and they were the family that were circuit riders for the pauper families, the paupers that died without families. So I say that that's an important lesson to just keep even that simplest thing, a beginning, a middle, with enough detail to get your story apart. And if you want to take classes in that, there's lots of many ways that you can do that. And an ending that provides that new hope, that new resolution. If you can end a story with hope, oh, please try to do that if you can. But why care? Why care? Because it feels good to care. I mean, I don't know about you, but I get into my journal and and I'm supposed to just dump your stories into your journal and not get too detailed. I can't help it. I just want to say, well, I could have said that better. And it's just, it's one of those things like art. It's like painting a great picture and learning how to make that picture even better. So I would encourage you, if you can do that, to do that. Finally, I want to mention curating or choosing, if you want to use that word. I had an 84-year-old student once who said she was curating her journals. Why? Because she was taking out the parts she didn't want other people to know. And if you're keeping a caregiver's journal, there might be things you say because you're despondent. Maybe you're having a really bad day and you say some things that maybe you would prefer others not know. So you might think about that. And when you're doing your journals and pulling out the kinds of things you need, and who knows, maybe you will be curating your journal at some point, or maybe you won't. Maybe you want everybody to know exactly everything that you were going through at the time. Now, you also have to choose your right story for the purpose. In my NAMI classes, National Alliance on Mental Illness, I have a lot of caregivers who are there. They are caring for people with serious mental illnesses. And what a high number of them want to do is they want to advocate. We have a tsunami coming at us. Caregivers, it's everywhere except where it should be, and policies that are created and funding that's being created for these people who are working enormously big jobs of caring for our most vulnerable citizens. And as the age increase happens to us, the age tsunami, it's going to happen more and more. You're going to have people with Alzheimer's. You're going to have people just aging. And my father aged till, he was blind and he was deaf. And it was very sad because, we couldn't, he didn't know how to live his life anymore. But you have to do, so they were writing to get up in front of their civic clubs. Civic clubs in our rural parts of, and I don't know where y'all are, but in the rural parts of our state are hungry for content. And they were perfecting those kinds of presentations, lessons of life, memoirs. Maybe you want to write your memoir to help people understand that day to day kind of blow that people need coming out. Small vignettes, small little moments. That's what I do. I write the small little moments. And in a few minutes, I'll talk to you about presenting those. How do you share those? There are many different ways you can, but I always try to include two things in every story that I write: humor. Even there are situations I can think of that don't have humor, but not many. Humor, and humor is so critical, and hope at the end, because as the human race, we are determined to find hope, aren't we? We're not naturally despairing, and yet there are so many people, as you well know now, who are lonely. It's an epidemic. If you can share things that inspire them, I think that's one of the things I love about my classes. I have a core group of people that come to every one of my classes. They bond together, they share together, they go to lunch together. All of those things are so important. And one of my favorite examples too is sometimes people don't want to share. Kathy Ploman, was a city councilwoman, I think she's decided not to run again. Her 84-year-old mother wrote a beautiful book about being a nurse. At 84, she wrote for the first time in her life. It was very well written. About being a nurse during the polio epidemic. I would have loved to have that book for nurses during the pandemic, but she said no. She wanted that only for her family or people like me that would share it privately with people like you and talk about it, but she didn't want it published for the general public. And sometimes that's true. And if that's what you want, then so be it. That's what needs to be done. Let's move on to the next slide about how to record a story. I keep my eye on the time here. How to record a story. First of all, number one thing, a lot of people do like the iPhone thing now. It's so easy to do. It's so easy to record. But you got to be careful with the caregiving and making sure that they know that you're recording it. Some people are very strange about that. I remember when my mother was dying of cancer, just the privacy these, and now my father was Depression era in World War II, and the generations kind of changed. But I remember one night we had to take her to the emergency room. She was on chemo and it never worked. And I leaned over to my dad. It had been suggested to me. He was in his 80s. And I said, Daddy, do you think maybe I should get a power of attorney? And he became livid. He thought I was saying I was going to control his finances. I said, no, 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 no. I just mean a medical power of attorney to help you out when we have to make the decisions we're going to have to make. And he calmed down. But again, I mean, here was a man who hid money under his mattress to think I was going to take over. So same thing goes for recording. A lot of fear of that, particularly in diseases, mental illnesses that many of you may deal with, like Alzheimer's or dementia. There becomes this, I kind of didn't understand that earlier in my life, but I do. You get shut off and you get scared. My father got scared at the end because of losing his hearing, losing his eyesight. I can't even imagine. That was the only time I ever saw signs of dementia, that he would get agitated and concerned. So always share with someone if you're going to record. But iPhones and all of those things, some people say they don't like to write. I think writing is something that, frankly, I think we should all engage in. It's sort of it's the opposite of all the technology we have available. The one thing you find when you're writing and writing in that journal is you have to take time. Now, my handwriting is atrocious. I'm not sure I can even read it the next day because I get a thought in my head and it's so easy to get on the computer and type it. But I try to handwrite my stories because it calms you down. Just that process of saying each word weighs 1,000 pounds and I'm going to write it out by hand. Uh, you can also use it as a post-it on post-it notes. A lot of people do storyboarding. If you're really serious and you're going to write a book or you're going to write something, writing the stories out and kind of planning them out. Don't try to write too many. I always tell people if you're going to do a book of vignette stories, tiny stories about people, about your caregivee, then map it out. Map it out. Make it be about certain themes. Maybe you have 5 themes, 4 stories per theme. And that's a control thing that is really important. And technology is really, really growing. And I understand that. And the temptation is very, very great. But that's kind of my prescription. I love Maya Angelou, and it's like, yeah, the agony of knowing, I'm a story warrior. I have to pull over sometimes. I just can't lose that story. Um, and I'm really trying to be very good about not doing it while I'm driving. That's a very ugly thing to do. So don't do that. But just, needing to capture that thought because it hooked onto something in your mind, hooked onto something that was really critical, important for you. So, how do you begin? How do you begin? Um, the setting. Um, I overheard a woman the other day in Panera. I don't know who she was interviewing. It was an older person. I don't know if it was a daughter. Kind of didn't get that sense. You know how you can kind of pick up on that? But she was asking her very probing questions. And the woman was responding. So it was obvious she was trying to collect stories from her. But each individual situation will dictate how you do that for the setting. Uh, Comfort and trust. That's what you're looking for, first of all. That's why you don't want to have a tape recorder going and they don't know what it is. Maybe it's making sounds or whatever. But you're building trust. And so by building trust, there's a lot more in the guide on this, but just kind of quietly getting that person to open up. What was the happiest day of your life? Maybe you kind of know something and you can trigger that. Um, Tell me about the service that you were in. It's Veterans Month, Veterans have, and I do a lot of teaching of veterans. Their stories are amazing. If you have a veteran in your life, capture that now because they're going away. The World War II ones are just about gone. And now we have the Vietnam ones, and some of their stories are so rich, and the world ought to know their stories. But building comfort and trust. So find a good place, even if it's, a couch, a certain couch. Find a warm, friendly place. But you don't know. Your loved one might be different, or you might be different in terms of what you need. Rely on memories that you have, because you just start asking probing questions. What's the happiest day of your life? What was the biggest challenge you ever faced? What was the best piece of advice you ever got? And I think I have taught some at retirement homes, and boy, do they take off on those questions. And I even I give up on the PowerPoints. They don't want to do the PowerPoints. They want to tell you their stories. Managing the stories is kind of, you got to have a certain amount of time you can devote to this, and devote to it as story collectors, and try to make it very pointed and focused. Again, if you don't have time, you can write notes that will trigger memories later when you can do that. Formal interviews. I don't think formal interviews work as well as just general, sitting down in a warm, comfortable spot and just letting them tell you their life story, and the wonderful stories that you get that tell the stories of their lives. Again, my dad. He tells this story, and he loved to tell me this story. The night I was born, there was a snow up to the yaya, and he went over the mountain, got my mom, put rags in his tires, got her to the hospital, the charity hospital in Frenchburg, Kentucky, and they kept her overnight. Now, typically, I think they keep you longer than that then than they do now. But the next morning, it was snow up to the windows. And he came in, and the nurse looked at him, and she said, "Sir, you're not taking that baby and that mama home in this weather." "I'm taking them home. I ain't got no insurance. I ain't got no money. I'm taking them home." And I'm kind of proof that he was able to do that, and I survived. Anyway, you get these wonderful, wonderful stories. Tell me about my birth, Daddy. Tell me about how it happened. Um, okay, so just to sum up that, use your heart. Let your heart be your guide. Again, no grades. A story map, a storyboard on how to do this, depending on the seriousness of how you want to approach this. If all you want to do is do something for family, I would urge you to think about advocacy. We desperately need some good stories out there. Small stories. Start small. One of my favorite websites is Zoom. No, not Zoom. Themoth.org. Themoth.org. They specialize all over the country in 5-minute stories, because if you can tell a story in 5 minutes, now they do presenting. You present your stories and you don't use notes, so you have to memorize the story. The important part about that is to start the story with you start and you end powerfully, and anything in the middle. You don't have to memorize the whole thing. It's a really wonderful way to learn how to tell a story. But tiny stories. Or journaling is another way to do that. So that's important. Now, sharing your story. Next slide. Let me see. Did I miss one here? Mr. Wheels, sustaining. Let's see. Did we have a sharing your story slide? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about that just for a moment. Sharing is like what humans are supposed to do, right? There is a lot of literature out there right now. When we share stories, it improves our health. When we form community, it improves your health. So if you want to keep this in yourself, then that's okay. You may have good reasons for that. But sharing it with others is so important. And if you have a story to tell that can make a difference, I'm sort of my philosophy is along the line that if the tree falls in the forest, will anybody be there to hear it? Make your story heard. We could use your stories. The veterans want to tell their stories. The generations, we've lost that touch. We live far apart from one another now. It's harder and harder to get that kind of thing corralled. Confidentiality is important. I've mentioned that. Maybe there are things you don't want to broadcast. I have recently, and I have very good news of it, but I'm going to share with you. I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I was stunned. I was knocked off my block over that diagnosis. And yet, when I finally recovered, I want to tell that story. of caregiving for myself and caregiving for others who are similarly diagnosed. So don't be shy about sharing your story. You will be amazed at how well it would be received. Um, and Frank, for instance, didn't know her story would be shared widely. And that may have been a difficult decision for her father, who lost all his family. Um, it'd be as big as the stage that you want it to be on. You could join a class and bond just with a small group of people, a writing group, form one yourself, or go to something like themoth.org for the 5 minute story. I think one of the things that people are most concerned about sharing is that sense of vulnerability. They're scared. Um, but have you ever seen someone lose their place? I did. That is one thing that's never happened to me, but I'm waiting. It'll happen to me. I'll be in the middle of a speech and I'll forget a line, or I'll get lost in my notes. I'll get off on a tangent and I won't know how to get back home. Okay. It makes you very vulnerable. And it's why public speaking is about, and that's one way to share is to do verbal presentations. But I'm going to tell you one of my favorite speeches I ever heard. Don't remember her name. She was giving a speech at a presentation thing that we needed to do, and she lost her place. Well, what'd she do? She didn't act nervous. She didn't act like she was going to lose her mind. What she said was, I've lost my place. I don't know where I am. They loved her for that. And you know why people love you for that? Because they feel vulnerable too. So that's kind of the bottom line. So whether your stories are read by 2 or 2 million, your writing is a legacy. Um, okay, I got to go pretty quickly, don't I, Hazel? Anyway, sustaining your story habit. Find a place, find a comfortable place, find your muse, something that's going to keep you going every single day so that you can write. Try a morning, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. And Alex Haley and every. Now, okay, we're going to move on, Hazel. We're going to go to Family Tree, Food, and Stories. One way to really get started here, I wrote a book, Family Tree, My Family Tree, Food, and Stories. It's available on Amazon, and it's about food. The food traditions and memories, a wonderful way to begin a process of collecting stories, capturing, preserving your special stories and recipes. That we're having a grand time with it. And when you get the copy of the PowerPoint, you'll see how to go to the podcast. That's one of the things that I'm doing with that with a partner in Florida. We're having a grand time. Every recipe tells a story, and I've been collecting some of the funniest food stories that you can imagine ever. My son has 10 children, 8 children, and he talks about the quantities of food that he has to prepare: pancakes, Italian, and one other, Chinese. So at the end, when all is said and done, we are all just walking each other home. Is that a beautiful saying? And if we can advance to that slide real quickly. um, Okay. When all is said and done, we are all just walking each other home. Remember that, because it's by an American. It's one of my favorite sayings. I was telling someone about it in the Joseph Beth line the other day, and some woman said, "When is this seminar? I want to know about it because I love that saying." Anyway, I'm going to end and just follow your heart and become the story warrior that you need to be. Thank you, Hazel. I guess I need to wrap up, don't I?